program for conversations and issues that matter. Now, before we get going, please turn off all cell phones and pagers. Today is the final forum of the season, but be sure to join us in the spring when we will explore themes such as American identity, faith and science, spirituality, human rights, as well as parenting and education. At this time, I'd like to turn your attention to the center of the room and ask you to please welcome our moderator, Brent Andrew, and today's guest, Bob McGee.
Well, we're very fortunate to have our guest today. We're going to talk about icons today. And we have an iconic place, Brooklyn, and an iconic sport, baseball. And really, a lot of the attention is going to be on an iconic time, which is a time kind of post-war America, post-war New York, a time we think of as kind of more innocent time in our country's history. I just want to start by reading just a short quote from Jacques Barzun's book, God's Country and Mine. Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball. So, some questions to think about this morning. What defines a place? It's people, it's history, sure. Does a place have a soul? If by soul you mean identity and energy and life force, then I'd say yeah. Places have soul. We're going to ask this question today. What happens to a place when its soul moves a continent away? We have with us today a good friend, an author, a teacher, the author of this book, The Greatest Ballpark Ever, Ebbets Field and the Story of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Please join me in welcoming Bob McGee.
Thank you.
So, Bob, you're a native of Brooklyn. You're Brooklynite. You're Brooklynander. What do you call somebody from Brooklyn?
We're Brooklynites.
Brooklynites. Okay, so you're a Brooklynite. Would you say that the Dodgers were the soul of Brooklyn?
Well, certainly for those goodly number of years, absolutely. And I think there's something that left Brooklyn with them that probably hasn't been replaced. But I think when you look at the story of the Brooklyn Dodgers, it's actually far more complex than that in terms of their impact on the borough. The very first games the Dodgers played as a franchise were played in 1883. And it was exactly 12 days before Chester A. Arthur walked across the Brooklyn Bridge for the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. And the field upon which they played at that time was the old Washington Park, which was at the corner of 4th Avenue and 3rd Street in Brooklyn. And on that ground was an old stone house, which Charles Byrne, who was the first owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, unceremoniously turned into a ladies' restroom, as it turned out. But that old stone house had actually been the place where, during the Revolutionary War, a battalion of 400 heroic Marylanders fought a fierce rearguard action to stop the advancing British, allowing the American troops to retreat back towards Fulton Ferry and across Fulton Ferry Landing into New Jersey. That original stone house, by the way, was actually destroyed in a Gatling gun demonstration shortly before World War I and then subsequently rebuilt. So you can go there today and see it. But there were 256 men that lost their lives on that particular spot. And I think for many, many people, that history was known. But what happened in subsequent generations is many people came to Brooklyn, the Germans and the Jews and the Italians and all of that. They, of course, brought with them their old traditions, and it was their children who came to embrace baseball. And the other thing that I think is so significant about the game, in terms of what Barzun said about it, is that it is something that happens during the course of our lives every day for 5 or 6 months of the year. and it has its own rhythm, and it's a rhythm that is easy to live with. You can drop into it and drop out of it. The wonderful thing about Ebbets Field, and it's actually very evident on that photo in the cover of the book, is just the aspiration in the building of that place and what that represented. Charlie Ebbets knocked together every single nickel he had to get that place built. And one of the things that I discovered during the course of researching the book was that he went into some pretty serious hock and actually had to sell off half the team before the Ebbets Field was opened in 1913. And he also was going through some pretty significant personal and emotional turmoil, too.
So, you talked about it being aspirational, which it certainly is, and there are architectural features of the ballpark which speak to stuff well beyond baseball, like the rotunda is an example of that. So describe the rotunda and why that was put into a baseball stadium.
Well, it was a circular room. It was 80 feet in diameter. It had a metal lath ceiling that was 28 feet high, and it had a ball and bat chandelier in the middle of the room. It was really quite grand for the time, considering that many of the ballparks, these concrete and steel ballparks were supposed to replace, were actually wooden ballparks. And the first had been Shibe Park in Philadelphia in 1909, Forbes Field, Comiskey Park, Fenway Park would follow, as would Wheatman Park in Chicago, which later became known as Wrigley Field. And this particular feature was very, very interesting. Charlie Ebbets had it designed, or Clarence Van Buskirk designed it, and put it in there so that fans could be shielded from inclement weather or the rain if they, it was a bad day and they happened to be, coming in or going out of the park. But it was one of the things, there was no other park ever designed the same way, because the design itself was flawed, because all the ticket windows were on the wall of that 28-foot diameter room, and what wound up happening was that people would fan out in the lines to buy the tickets towards the center of the room, and then fans who were holding tickets would come in. And actually, during the very first month the ballpark was open, there was some pretty serious crowd control situations that got out of hand in there that almost resulted in a couple of people almost got killed, because it almost was like a panic situation.
Kind of like its era's Who concert in Cleveland, kind of thing, same kind of thing.
Well, I suppose the motivation was somewhat different, but
So the people who were in Brooklyn at the time that the ballpark was built, designed and built, what were they aspiring to? What was Brooklyn about in those
well, I
days?
think Brooklyn has always been a place in the process of becoming, and it's still in the process of becoming today. There are many new populations in Brooklyn, Caribbean Americans, others who weren't there 20, 25 years ago. The demographic is constantly changing. What actually has been an interesting revelation just in the past few months is that for the first time in 35 or 40 years, the percentage of whites living in Brooklyn has actually increased. So, for quite a long time, people were talking about the white flight from the cities in the 50s and 60s and all of that. I think it's always been a staging ground. It's a place where a lot of immigrants arrived and, where they got good educations and went elsewhere.
So the immigrants who were around kind of at the turn of the century and in the first couple of decades of the 20th century were from
Germany, Italy, for the most part. The Dutch had arrived, obviously, first, and the Irish had arrived, 1840s, 1880s.
So was their aspiration assimilation into kind of mainstream America, or was their aspiration?
I think so. The parents obviously kept a lot of the old traditions, and the children, of course, adopted their own. There always seemed to be a great identity with the game of baseball, though. And when I looked at this historically, it was kind of interesting. In 1858, in New York, there were some 75 amateur teams in Brooklyn. And by contrast, in Manhattan, there were only about 25, even though at that point, Brooklyn, of course, superseded Manhattan in population later on, but at that point, Manhattan obviously was larger. So, when people talk about baseball being, having sort of a unique hold in Brooklyn, in a manner of speaking, they were right. It really was something that was bred in the bone there. And obviously during the Civil War, both the North and South, there were many teams and many, certainly, soldiers that kind of played as an avocation, although played to kill each other. I think that was the time, obviously, when the game really took hold of the American psyche.
So, the particular connection of Brooklyn to the Dodgers, talk about that.
Well, the team got its name in 1890, and obviously, I'm sure many of you know the story, that the name comes from dodging trolleys. Given the fact that the red car exited Los Angeles before the Dodgers got there, there's probably absolutely no reason that they should be called Dodgers in Los Angeles, because there's really no trolleys to be had. But
Much less Dodge, right?
yeah. And that's where the name came from. There were several other nicknames that they had over the course of the years. The team was called the Robins in the 19-teens when Wilbert Robinson managed the team. And before that, they had been called the Superbas because a fellow named Ned Hamlin was managing the team. And there was a vaudeville act at the time called Hamlin's Superbas. So they've had a couple of different handles over the years. After Wilbert Robinson was dismissed as manager in 1931, the team was taken over by Max Carey, who managed the Dodgers for a couple of years. And his real name was Canarius. And people said, well, maybe they should call the team the Canaries, but that didn't happen. They were really the Dodgers.
So talk about the identification, if you would, the identification between the borough and those guys.
It's very, very interesting. The Ebbets Field, and for that matter, I mean, baseball attendance has changed markedly from decade to decade. And given the way people would work during the week, games were scheduled at usually about 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon in the teens and the 20s. And they would get, some people would be able to leave their jobs on Wall Street and go to the ballpark, or they'd get some kids and teachers who were coming out of school, and sometimes they would go to the games as well. It had an interesting feature, when it rained, if there was going to be a rain out, they would take the flag down. They would leave the flag up as long as the game was still scheduled to be played. And some of the reminiscences I got from one gentleman in the 1930s who went to PS 161. He said, my teacher would have me go over to the window to check to see if the flag was still up, to find out. And the Ebbets family lived not far from the ballpark in those days. And the people would call the house to find out if the game was still on. And Dorothy Ebbets Dahlmeyer, Charlie Ebbets' daughter, wrote a family history in 1982. And she said, we kids really should have been paid for doing that. We were always taught to be polite to people whenever they called, because the people invariably would also have their opinions about what the manager did in the last game, and kind of sort of, listen, pass this along. And they would proceed to say, don't play that guy in left field. If Bryce is through, we can't pitch anymore. Get rid of him.
But see, that brings up another thing, which I think people who only know kind of newer baseball wouldn't even think of this, and that is that Ebbets Field was right in the middle of a neighborhood.
That's right.
Which a lot of newer era ballparks are out on the outskirts of town.
Although when it was built, it was not. When it was built, it was Charlie Ebbets wound up, unlike today where you have eminent domain, of course, which is a very big question around, especially with that recent Supreme Court decision. Charlie Ebbets had to purchase all those parcels for Ebbets Field surreptitiously. So he wound up going to a friend of his who was a long-time connected city lawyer who hired a real estate guy who hired a couple of other people, and the people who were selling had no idea why they were selling or what the end use of these pieces of property they were selling was going to be for. And at the time when Ebbets Field was built, Ebbets Field was 2 blocks from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. For any of you who know Brooklyn, and at the time Ebbets Field was built, that was an ash dump. It would be another 2 years before that opened. So he was sort of betting on the come. He knew that the Brighton subway would go not far from there. That was all being developed. Charlie had been a state senator at one juncture. He ran in 1895 and was turned out, he was a Democrat, he was turned out during the McKinley sweep in 96 and then became a city councilor, I think, in 97. So the neighborhood grew up around the ballpark. And coincidentally, after the ballpark shut down, the neighborhood sort of died around the ballpark.
Yeah, not
For a time.
Not coincidentally, right?
Yeah.
We were talking last night about ball players on the Dodgers living in Brooklyn.
Right.
And I remember, there's that great picture, I think it was in Life magazine, of Willie Mays playing stickball with the kids in his neighborhood.
Right.
There was a time when ball players lived in the communities where they played and probably did other things in the off-season too, like insurance businesses or that kind of
Well, they did, and I think for me, one of the reasons that I took this on was that Pee Wee Reese actually lived on my block in Brooklyn, and the Dodgers left when I was 5 years old, and Duke Snyder lived down the block on 97th Street and Marine Avenue in Brooklyn. And of course, at that age you have cartoon heroes. You don't really know who these guys are. But as I've said to people, I started to really develop a love for baseball when I was about 7 years old, which is, I think, when it happens for most kids that begin to love the game. It became very evident to me very quickly that something had been lost, especially hearing all the elders talk about, kid, you can go to a game at Yankees the first time you go to a ball game, especially when we grew up watching black and white television sets and a whole idea of going out there and you see this great, big, beautiful expanse of emerald green, just how magical that moment is. And I remember coming home as a kid. The very first game I went to was Old Timers game at Yankee Stadium in 1961. Zach Wheat was there, dressed in a business suit, 80 years old.
Let's pretend that we don't know who Zach Wheat is.
Zach Wheat was the left fielder for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he was a great hitter, a batting champion, and a great player, Hall of Fame. You hear these names, and all of a sudden they appear. But when I went home and talked about, just how beautiful it was, people said to me, "Yeah, kid, that's great that you saw Yankee Stadium. That's really all right, but you really should have seen a game at Ebbets Field. Ebbets Field was the greatest ballpark ever." And I think the reason I came to feel that way about Ebbets Field was because Ebbets Field, you were so close to the field that you were a part of the whole experience. You could hear the chatter on the field. You could essentially embrace the experiences that you were immersed in it. I had one sentence, I think, in the first chapter of the book where I described how for many people going to a ball game today is a diversion, whereas at Ebbets Field it was an immersion. And the other features that made it so memorable for so many people was that crooked outfield wall where the bottom half of it beveled inward, so that you could have a ball that would either hit the fence and drop straight down, or hit the top half of the concrete barrier and bounce one way, or hit the bottom half and bounce another way. And then there were a couple of different angles on the scoreboard. And Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the longtime baseball commissioner, said while he was leaning on his cane one day watching a game at Ebbets Field, says, "Watching a game here is like being in a pinball game," and it was. There
But that, I mean, that brings up what I think is a pretty interesting thing, and that is that you look at the kind of much older ballparks that are still in existence, and there's a eccentricity to them,
Right.
which maybe now has been rediscovered and maybe now hasn't, but for the period of the kind of 60s through 80s, there was a corporate sameness. You know, there were these huge blocks of plastic seats and even, you know, perfect AstroTurf.
Concrete poles,
Right, exactly.
symmetrical foul lines, all of that,
Exactly.
yeah. And Camden Yards was the first of the new genre of the ballparks. And by the way, I think McGowan did a great job with the ballpark here in San Francisco. And not coincidentally, he had been to Ebbets Field. He knew Ebbets Field. I think in many respects, people sort of looked at, they saw the experience there as an extension of their own experience, it was their vicarious struggle that was being played out on the field. And, that obviously took on a much greater significance in 47 when we see Jackie come on the scene. And what a great place for Jackie Robinson to break the code.
Okay, talk about Jackie Robinson coming into Major
Well,
League Baseball.
it's a fascinating story. I'm sure all of you have heard the story about how Branch Rickey made the decision that he was going to take on this very, very formidable task of integrating Major League Baseball, and the other owners, in most cases, were almost completely aligned against him when he decided to undertake this. He did have the courage of his convictions and a great resolve. But what also is lost in the very popular story, the popular story is this. The popular story is that when Branch Rickey was a baseball manager of the Ohio Wesleyan team in 1903, he took a team to South Bend to play at Notre Dame. And there was an African-American catcher by the name of Charlie Thomas who they wouldn't allow to be registered at the hotel. And Rickey argued with the clerk and said, well, how about if he sleeps on a cot in my room? Is that okay? And the clerk grudgingly agreed. And Rickey had sent Thomas ahead to the room, and when he got up there, Charlie Thomas was pulling at his skin, saying, "It's my skin, Mr. Rickey, it's my skin. If only I could change the color of my skin, I could be like everybody else." And that, of course, had this tremendous impact on Rickey, as it would on any person that had any sort of moral fiber like that. And he vowed that he would change that. Now, what's often lost in this story is that there were other circumstances that contributed to that change that were very, very significant political developments that started with this. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph decided that he was going to lead the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in a march on Washington unless Roosevelt opened up defense industry jobs to the black community. And the prospect of having a march on Washington in 1941 was totally unpalatable to Roosevelt. After all, he was criticizing the Axis, he was criticizing Germany, and all of that. What could they do if they had that sort of propaganda going? So he signed an executive order that established the Federal Employment Practices Commission that outlawed discrimination for those jobs. And there was legislation passed in New York in 1944 called the Ives-Quinn Bill, which Governor Dewey signed, which essentially did the same thing. And when that happened, it put the baseball industry, interstate commerce, Supreme Court protection, what have you, essentially put the baseball industry on notice that, you can't run an outfit that discriminates on the basis of race. So they were going to have to do something. And that's the part of the story that sort of contributes to the fact that there was going to be this change that is often left untold because it's kind of complex in its own way.
So he became the vanguard of what was inevitable for baseball.
Yeah, I mean, if it didn't happen one way, it was going to happen another way. They were going to, it was going to be forced upon them.
Right.
there were already at that point individuals who were threatening to throw up picket lines outside the ballparks, and in one case they did picket the polo grounds. So the change was coming.
Yeah.
And
Can I get back to something you were talking about earlier, Bob, which was, you were talking about kind of the reasons behind you committing yourself to writing this book. And I think I remember you talking about starting this book, how long was it, a dozen years ago?
I started work on this actually in 1993.
There's a story at the beginning of your book about you seeing a poster in a pizza parlor in San Francisco.
That's right.
Would you tell that? Because I think, to me, that speaks to a lot.
Yeah, it was just off Chestnut Street on Steiner. There was it's a pizza parlor. It used to be exactly, I think, where Barney's Hamburgers is now. And there was a picture in there. Sat down. I lived in San Francisco between 84 and 94. I lived in the Marine. And got a slice of pizza one day and sat down. And I'm looking at this photo, and it's a photo of an old Bishop's Crook, New York lamppost. And I'm looking at it for a second, and it looks like a construction site, and on the construction site are posters that say, Kennedy for President. And I look closer at it, and I look at the stanchion on the street sign, and it said Bedford Avenue, Montgomery Street. That was the Ebbets Field site. Ebbets Field demolished in the spring of 1960. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And as I wrote in the book, for the scores of eyes that probably passed over that on a daily basis, very few people would get the message. But for me, the cognition was kinetic. Drove to the heart of where I came from, who I was. After hearing about Ebbets Field for years and years, the very first time I went to the site, I was 20 years old. It was 1972 while I was a student at Brooklyn College. I had read Roger Conn's Boys of Summer, and I said, I need to go see where that was. I need to see the physical spot that it was on. I need to drive around the block. It was in December. I had a motorcycle. I drove up there. It was cold. The streets were pretty empty, and but the experience, just going around went around about 4 times, just trying to feel the size of what had been there. Essentially, it's like the ghost of the sailing ships that ride the same harbor. I realize that's a part of the legacy of the place that I'm of. And I think so many of us have that about the places we come to love or the places we've been. And that's what's so significant about, caring for a place, its landmarks, those things that you treasure, the things that are important.
What did you see when you drove around this block? What was there in 70s?
Well, it's still there. There was a Mitchell Lama housing project, 28 stories, 1,617 apartments that was put on that site. And as I drove around that block, I was seeing something else. I was visualizing what had been there. And just the gentle slope of Bedford Avenue at that point, the same place where all those home run balls went over the wall onto Bedford Avenue with all those kids, chasing those home run balls, in the wake of stopped traffic and hordes of little kids going. There was one fellow who recounted to me that some days they'd spend all afternoon out there. Nobody did a home run. And they'd be out there again the next day. And if you could actually catch a home run ball and then came back to present it, they would let you into the ballpark, which gives rise to another story that I must tell you. In the early days, Ebbets Field's roof was pitched, and in the early days, I guess, the difference between profit and loss for some of these teams would be the balls that they'd lose every year that went into the stands. And the fans, when there were foul balls up on the roof of Ebbets Field, Charlie Ebbets had the reputation of being something of a tightwad, given some of the acrimonious contract disputes he'd had with his players. there was an expression whenever the ball landed on the roof, there were some people who said that the roof was actually pitched and would go to a pipe where the ball would come back down into Charlie Evetts' office, you know. So whenever the ball would go up on the roof, they'd say, oh, there goes one for the office.
So, you know, a couple of years ago, I went to a ball game here at AT&T Park.
Isn't it terrible? I mean, these corporate names for the ball.
It is, well, actually, that is terrible. We'll talk about that in a second. I was going to say is terrible is being in a luxury box, which is essentially like a hotel suite with televisions and glass. It's almost as if you're in someone's living room sort of watching through a screen, which to me is the antithesis of the baseball that you're describing.
Oh, well, unfortunately, you would probably know the person who sat next to you at Evetts Field all too intimately, more so than you would prefer, by the end of the day. You know, those seats were fairly small. You would never want to build a ballpark the same way, but to be in a ballpark that was like that would be something that just you would absolutely never forget. In fact, one of the stories that I had was from a Reverend McGee at the Unitarian Church in Brooklyn Heights by the corner of Pierpont and Monroe Place, who talked about when he first came to Evetts Field in 1952, he thought all this stuff about the Dodgers was just so much hokey. But after the Dodgers lost what was one of those terribly bitter defeats at the hands of the Yankees in the 7-52 series, the parish assistant, Gladys Hudson, said, oh, I think you should go see Mrs. So-and-so. I said, why is that? I saw her just last week. He says, oh, I think she's probably feeling pretty low right now. And he, since he was a young assistant minister, and Gladys Hudson had a lot of sway at this church, young assistant ministers did what she said. And as he recounted it, he said, I went to her home, and I had never seen anyone respond to this sort of an event in this way at any point in my life. He said, she looked to my untrained eye to possibly be dying. He said, there was really nothing wrong with her physically. The Dodgers had lost was all that was the matter. And he said, what I came to realize in the next few years was that she was someone who knew every stat about every player, and not only that, knew the names of their kids, and their birthdays, and their anniversaries, just knew everything about them. And at one point, when one of the children of one of the less well-played players had a drug problem, she directed Reverend McGee to make a sizable contribution through his discretionary fund for treatment of that young man at a clinic outside New York, and didn't want the player to know who it was, who had done it. It's just something that, you know, she wanted to have done. And to my mind, you hear any number of stories, you know, people in the neighborhood dying, players going to the wakes and all of that. It said something about a sense of community that doesn't exist today. And that's something that I think all of us, wherever we are, if we really care about community, have to work hard at getting back to. And it really requires some extra effort on everybody's part to get there.
So, Bob, as you've noticed, I stepped away from you.
That's right. My soliloquies.
Yeah, it probably happens around your house. Who does that? So, I'm going to... Thank you
More
very
than
much.
once.
I'm going to be walking around taking questions. Please wait for the microphone if you have one. And if you're online and want to ask a question, please use the form that's on your screen right now. You're up first.
Thank you. Very meaningful, very, very sweet touch. The question, you said we've lost things. Is the metaphor that the Brooklyn Dodgers moved to Los Angeles, which is looked at as this vast soulless place. What's happening to our country and culture using baseball and the Dodgers as a metaphor?
Well, I think in many respects, that symbolized that transition into the new age that we've seen, and the kind of greed that was exemplified by that move. And it was really nothing more than greed, because, you know, when the Brooklyn Dodgers were moved, they were the most profitable franchise in baseball. Even though their park was smaller than, say, Yankee Stadium and some of the other parks, between their television deals and other revenue, they were the most profitable team in baseball. I think, you know, we see the same sort of evidence in spiraling salaries at the, you know, at the upper echelons of corporations, people being squeezed out of pensions. There's a lot of ethical connections that you see up and down the line in terms of the kinds of changes which have affected people and families in ways that are not good for them and not good for the rest of us. We see some of the consequences. And it's the question is, to what extent could we reverse something like that? And to what extent can our heroes be made more meaningful to us as those heroes were then?
I'm one of those demon kids that grew up in Los Angeles. But my dad took me to some of the very early games of the Dodgers when they were played in the Coliseum.
Yeah.
And I reflect on, there was a night in the Coliseum where 100,000 people gathered to honor Roy Campanella.
That's right.
I would be interested in a reflection that you might have on the person of Roy Campanella and his affiliation and association with Brooklyn and with the Dodgers and with the field.
I think Roy Campanella was just a remarkable man, and I have memories of watching him. He used to host a program between games of Yankee doubleheaders for a time in the early 1960s, and there was a tremendous goodness in him. You know, as Jackie was fiery in one way, there was this, there was sort of a whole different sort of representation that you saw in Campanella, but yet Campanella's courage was no less than Jackie's in so many respects. And, he won 3 Most Valuable Player awards. I think I would be safe in saying that he was universally loved, and he also played in some tremendous pain. In 1954, he played for half the season with a broken hand, for God's sakes, and he was a catcher, you know. And he was, you had a center field in New York in the 50s, of course, where you had Snyder and Mays and Mantle, and you had catchers like Campanella and Vera. And people wonder why New Yorkers have this special thing for baseball.
You know, on a lighter note, I've always wondered why they have the chutzpah to call it the World Series. It isn't.
That's right. That's right. We're a very unique country. We do have a rather exalted opinion of ourselves in so many ways, and if what happens here, as far as we're concerned, it's the world. So I think we'll see some. It'll be interesting to see if there's some. Obviously, Major League Baseball's trying to market in different places now. Witness the World Baseball Classic, which they had earlier in the spring, there have been games now played in Monterrey, Mexico, and places like that. Whether or not we'll ever get beyond the U.S. and Canada will be interesting to see.
Growing up 90 miles south of Brooklyn, it was a sad commentary to realize that Campanella grew up in our town, and the Phillies would not take him, and he got hired by the Dodgers.
Right.
I want to ask you to speak a little bit about free agency and how that's added to the question that came up over there earlier about how the whole neighborhoods have just changed, and how a 5-year-old or a 9-year-old today really can't stay with his favorite player because he doesn't know where that player's going to be next year.
Yeah. I think what's happening to us as a culture is that our kids are growing up a lot faster, aren't they? So I think they're realizing that the impact of business decisions, certainly at a much earlier age than I mean, and they see those things affecting their fathers, you know, they see daddy changing jobs. I mean, there's no cradle to grave affiliation in corporate America anymore either. So, yeah, I think it does have consequences for baseball in terms of the identity kids have with the game. I don't think that a child growing up today has the same identification with baseball, or could, that I had. Good gosh. I mean, World Series games were played during the day when I was a kid. If you watch playoff or World Series games now, you're going to bed 1:32 in the morning. You know, you can't really let your kid do that if you care about your kid's education. So they can't feel the same way, and you know, to your question. And free agency, well, you know, the players have rights. They do have rights, and hats off to Marvin Miller for essentially liberating them from the onus of the owners. Marvin Miller and Kurt Flood, for that matter. I guess, you know, they're aspiring to make as much money as they can, as quickly as they can.
I grew up in the beer capital and heavy industry capital, just north of Chicago, that little town called Milwaukee, with the Milwaukee Braves.
57, 58.
And I remember going to games with some passion, but there was even a greater sense of mystery when you listened on the radio. This was you were right there with the action, and you really didn't need a television per se. But the passion was all, very real and tangible, and, talk on the streets. But it never got to the point of violence. And I just saw, again, one of my favorite movies that features in the opening shots the Dodgers. It's an old movie called Arsenic and Old Lace, where they're having this brawl. And then, the caption reads, "And across the bridge in the civilized world." And they go through this whole transition into New York. If the neighborhood, per se, created the Dodgers and the field, why is it that they were not able to come together after the loss and recreate a new neighborhood association, a new neighborhood feel, a new team that Brooklyn could own and say, this is us?
You know, they're still trying to do that. There's a plan afoot now, actually, to have a Frank Gehry designed basketball arena on the same site that O'Malley actually wanted to place Evans Field at the junction of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenue. And the other thing about Brooklyn that's very important to know is that it is a very vital community, and there are, within Brooklyn certainly, a number of communities where individuals have labored hard to preserve what's best about the local culture, whether it's the architecture, it's the traditions, and there's also a number of groups that work interfaith across racial, ethnic, religious lines to ensure that the kind of community that we all would like to envision certainly has some fertile ground. Whether or not it can ever come together in the same way that the Dodgers were able to unite Brooklyn is still open to question, and it's been 1957, 2007, it will be 50 years. So it hasn't quite happened yet, but I do think people still feel a very strong sense of identity with Brooklyn. Even some of the newcomers who don't know the history of those heroic Marylanders who fought that rearguard action that allowed Washington's troops to escape across Fulton Ferry Landing. You know, there's different new battles from generation to generation. A lot of them have to do with the economy. A lot of them have to do with understanding. But in each case, I think there's always that cadre of enlightened, visionary people who try to lead. And whether or not others follow is not always something that we can assure.
Thank you for these memories. I'm sitting here remembering growing up in Pittsburgh Pirates and going to Forbes Field and the 1960 World Series and wearing my Beat 'em Bucks beanie to
I
high
cried.
school.
By the way.
What?
I still remember Mazeroski's
Oh,
song.
yeah, no, Mazeroski.
I was 8 years, I was 8 years old, I
Elroy
cried.
face, and the whole thing, yeah, and the death of Roberto Clemente not too many years
Sure.
after that. And
1973.
all of that, wonderful, wonderful memories. And the question that I have is a different one. We now still love baseball. The Oakland A's are the team here, although the stadium's down. The fan base, it seems to it seems from my anecdotal experience, my unstudied observation, that the African American attendance at baseball games is declining year after year after year. And I wonder if I'm wrong about that, which of course I hope I am. And if I'm not wrong, if that's accurate, why is that?
Well, you're not wrong, although I wouldn't say that it's declined, it's just never been high. And I think there's a reason for that. I mean, I think the reason for that is, certainly right after Jackie Robinson came in and all of that, there was great interest in the African American community in terms of following him. But that the community doesn't forget what happened to it at the hands of officialdom in baseball, where essentially there was that segregation that was propagated for years and years. I've spoken with a friend of mine in Bedford-Stuyvesant, who I went to a game with, corrections officer. First game he ever went to in his life, watches on television all the time. First game he ever went to. And I said, how could that be, Matt? I know you love baseball. He watches it. And he reminded me. He reminded me of what the history was. That essentially from the time that Moses Fleetwood Walker was prohibited from playing baseball when he was in the 1800s, black catcher, till the time that Jackie Robinson played, there were great players like Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and everything else, and they had to play at Dexter Park in Brooklyn, not at Ebbets Field. In fact, there were a number of players who played on the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1930s who would moonlight and play games at Dexter Park afterwards against the traveling black teams. They play under different names. I mean, these were guys who just loved to play baseball, or they wanted to make an extra buck, and it didn't matter to them. They didn't believe in those, segregation canards that would keep people apart. I think that's part of the reason. I mean, that's my opinion. I think that's probably a good research topic, and it probably deserves its own book.
Hey, Bob, I got a question back over here.
Yeah.
Hi, it's a pleasure meeting you. I'll have to put your book on my Christmas list to read.
Thank you.
I'm a product of that era, and I remember being in Ebbets Field and the Schaefer sign,
Right.
and we light up on the H for the hit and all that business.
Right.
Also, it was my first job. I used to get off the BMT on Church Avenue,
Oh.
my first full-time job. And the Black League, I used to watch actually the polo grounds. I saw Satchel Paige.
Uh-huh.
And the stadium, well, New York, we had it all. We had the three teams, the three major teams. But somehow, I can't seem to get that feeling when I go to see baseball here and these pumped up steroid people playing. So I lose it, and I'm sorry about that. But I can't see it. And of course, as kids, as a kid growing up, we sat in the bleachers. But today, it's a fortune for these kids to go see baseball.
There's still relatively inexpensive tickets to be had, but the proportion of them to the overall number of seats is dwindling, and I think it will continue to dwindle. But you're right, comparatively to what it was in the old days. Of course, I got memories from people in the 40s who talked about how the bleacher seats then were 50 cents, which to them was a fortune at that time. In fact, during World War II, there was, if you could take, if you could get something like 50 pounds of scrap metal for the war effort and bring that to Ebbets Field, they let you into the ballpark for free. So the old saw was how many mothers were missing the wash tub filled with everything, stuff being dragged down Bedford Avenue. You mentioned the Schaefer sign. He's referring to it as a Schaefer beer sign over the right field scoreboard at Ebbets Field. That used to, the H in the Schaefer would light up if there was a contested play where there would be a hit or error. The H would light up for hit, or the E would light up for error. And of course, there also was a very famous sign at the base of that scoreboard, the H star hit sign, win suit sign, and it was a long, low sign. And for many years, the Dodgers had Carl Furillo playing in right field, and it was a very, very difficult sign to hit. And one of the things that I undertook was trying to find out who exactly had hit it and how often. And I found out that the first player to hit it was Mel Ott in 1931. And then there was a fellow by the name of Woody English who played third base for the Chicago Cubs, who was traded to Brooklyn in 1937. He was a right-handed hitter that sliced the ball right down the right field line, so the outfielders would play him over that way. And he hit that sign 3 times in 1937. And I was telling the late, great sports writer Leonard Coppett that story. Of course, Leonard had lived out here for so many years in Palo Alto. And Leonard said to me, well, did he get the suits? And I said, well, Leonard, I assume he did. He looked at me and said, don't assume. So, and yeah, it's a good newspaper reporter for you. So I got something called the Smalling and X baseball guide that lists the last known address for every player, or if the person has died, the date and place of their death. And I looked up Woody English. And Woody English at that time was still alive and living in Ohio. And I called him up and I said, Woody, I said, those 3 times you hit the sign in 1937, I said, did you get the suits? And he laughed, and he says, I'll tell you, he said, I went to Abe Stark's. And Abe Stark wasn't there, there was another tailor there. And he went over to this little box, and he went looking down through the papers, and he says, yeah, Woody, you got 3 coming. He says, come on over here. And as Woody English told me, he said, and he showed me these 3 pretty cheap-looking things, and I said to him, listen, just give me 1 good suit. And he says, all right, Woody, come on back here. And he says, that's what I got, 1 good suit.
Bob, we come close to the end of our time. I have all these questions yet to ask, and I blame you for them.
Well, if anybody has sent in questions, I'll be happy to answer them online. So.
This is our last forum of this year. And it's been an extraordinary year, and I'd like to thank all our guests. Thinking back, we've had Ann Lamott and Brian McLaren, Ann Rice, Bishop N.T. Wright. Joe Good was up right here, leading our audience in dance. It really has been an extraordinary year, and I'd like to thank all our guests. And of course, I'd like to thank our audience, both here and our audience online. We start our new season on January 7th. Our guest will be Dan Sansucci, who has written over 50 books for children. And he is going to talk about what it's like to write books for kids who are more attached to their computers, video games, and televisions than they are in books. So I think that would be pretty interesting. I'd like you to remember, please, that we can't do any of this without your support. To show us your support in some way, we would be most appreciative of it. Let me take this opportunity to thank our guest today, Bob McGee.
Thank you. Thank you.
As always, I'd like to remind you, 11 o'clock, we'd like everyone to join us for worship. Today especially, we're saying goodbye to Fran Tornquist, our canon pastor and vice dean. This is proud to be known as a house of worship for all people. You are all welcome. Thank you all very much.
All right, you can go now, it's okay.